All right, good morning. It's going to go ahead and be our World History Review Day. As we've talked about before with these, you don't have anything to do today whatsoever. I got a couple emails before putting this one out. On review days, unless I say otherwise, all you are responsible for doing is watching the review and or participating in the live ones. Entirely up to you. So, with that in mind, today we're going to be talking about the consequences of European imperialism in Africa, as that is what all of your readings focused on this week. In particular, the goal is to, again, continue to link those motives that we've talked about to the different things that happen in Africa during imperialism. So the economic, political, social Darwinism, exploratory, technological, all those things that we talked about are going to continue to influence how imperialism takes its shape in Africa and what sort of long-lasting consequences it has, all of which are bad. No good ones, none whatsoever. And that's kind of the other moral of today. So it's going to be kind of a shorter one due to the fact that we only had 2 days of lessons. And what we're going to focus on are connecting the various resistance movements that you guys read about to motives, and then in turn making connections between motives and those lasting impacts that you guys had to read through, especially because these seem to be some areas of confusion. So with that in mind, here we go. Resistance. So you guys had a big old reading about resistance movements at the start of this week, and it dealt almost entirely with how they all failed. And in these movements, there are 2 major motives that kind of drive this whole interaction. And those are the economic motive and the technological. So as a reminder, Europeans had looked to Africa as a way to expand their economies and get a lot of wealth out of them. And that had been one of the driving forces behind why they wanted to go to Africa to begin with. New markets, like we've talked about, and raw resources. With that being their driving motive, what that also means is that Europeans for the most part were not going to Africa because they wanted to make friends, they wanted to get rich. And as we had talked about last review, the Europeans that were kind of behind the game, they were particularly motivated to just make money and that's it. So like Britain, that indirect rule that, oh, you guys can kind of have your lifestyle, not the case for all the other Europeans. And so they were particularly abusive for it. In the reading, for example, the ones that you guys read about, the British wanted to bore diamonds in South Africa and their gold, and the Germans wanted cash crops from all of their East African colonies. And because all these guys cared about was wealth, that's it. Like Germans weren't there to make friends, British weren't there to make friends, they were there to make money. And there goes a cat. And so they just did whatever it took to get that. And so it transitioned into harsh abuse because, interestingly enough, when you force people to work for free, which was the cheap way to do things, they're not super inclined to want to do it. And then you're given an option, right? You can either choose to be nice and understanding and compromise, or you can go the easier route of, we're just going to beat you into submission. And so it translates, this economic desire translates into a lot of harsh treatment in the British. You guys read about how when the Boers were unhappy, they just killed them, whole families of them, put them in concentration camps, kind of getting some Nazi Germany before we get to Nazi Germany. The Belgians, as you read in the Berlin conference, cut people's hands off. So, you know, sending a message there, you don't want to work, then you don't need it. And then the Germans just straight up forced them into single crop societies where these subsistence farmers, these African communities where they raised enough food for themselves and that's it, suddenly had to grow exclusively tobacco. And as we'll talk about next year with Jamestown, you cannot survive off of just tobacco. You will all die. That's kind of how that works. And all of this abuse, where it comes back to the resistance, is the fact that these are the motives for resistance. Just like economics motivates the Europeans to be cruel to the Africans, this in turn motivates the Africans to try and fight back. This is why we have a conflict, because at the core, Europeans are more concerned about money than the actual people of Africa. And then this shifts nicely into the second component, the second motive, which is the technological one, which, as we talked about, again, refreshing this one, part of the reason that Europe as a whole even begins to look at Africa is because it's a lot easier now. Like, they can travel to Africa way quicker with the better boats. They can kick the crap out of the Africans way better with their guns, and they can transport a lot more. And that second one, the kicking the crap out of them with guns, that's going to be the main reason all these resistance movements fail, because of weapons. Because in Africa, they don't have anything to compare to the Europeans. And that becomes readily apparent in two of the major resistance movements you guys read about. Again, the Boers with Britain and the Germans with the Mahi Mahi. The Boers, for example, had predominantly antiquated weapons. They had been Dutch settlers from the age of exploration, so they still have, like, they have some guns, but they're like traditional blunderbusses. You think of like a very, very poor musket, that's what they have. Whereas the British have the more modern rifle, a lot better cannons. And so that's why they're able to force them into concentration camps, because they're able to shoot them from further away and kill more of them faster. We're also progressing into the machine gun era. And that transitions to the Germans, where the Mahi Mahi were very motivated. Like, they did not lack for a desire to get rid of their German oppressors. The problem is that, as you read, they fought with spears and shields. And despite having this faith that they could defeat them, that doesn't do a whole lot to protect you from actual bullets. And so again, this technological advantage allows the Europeans and the Germans to just wipe the floor with African resistance and prevent them from staging any sort of successful turnabout. And that's also why Menelik II in Ethiopia is the only one who's successful. Yes, he was able to play off the French and the British, and yes, he did beat the Italians, but at the end of the day, it's because he bought French and Russian guns. It's not because he was some great general, which, again, he was to a degree, but that doesn't matter if you're a great general with spears against someone who has a machine gun. Like, there's only so much you can do. Menelik was a great leader in part as well because he had all those European guns. And so again, these core motives are the defining characteristics of imperialism. They're the main reason it starts, and then the main reason it continues, and they define these resistance movements, with the Africans unable to compete with the with the technology, and the economics driving the Europeans to be incredibly harsh to one another. And then this brings us to the lasting impacts, and I've tried to split these up into the different motives as well. And so, as you guys should have hopefully seen from the videos, Africa is not wanting for long-lasting poor consequences of imperialism. Pretty much every single action that the Europeans take has created a problem that Africa still experiences today, whether it is with their societies, with their economies, with their farming, with their social structure. All of that can stem from a European motive and how it directly negatively impacted them. Again, economics. We keep bringing this up because it's the most important driving factor behind imperialism. And because Europe was predominantly in Africa to exploit Africa for wealth, you see a lot of negative consequences stemming from that, like the one-sided transportation, the fact that, as you guys should have read, Belgium made railroads that go exclusively outward. Real great if you're trying to take things out, not super great if you're trying to, travel anywhere else in the country, in the Congo. And so you see that even today in the Congo, where their trucking routes are horrendous. Their roads are horrible because no one gave them the structure for them. The single crop economies, the fact that you look at, again, the Congo, their money comes almost entirely from exporting things out, and farming itself really struggles. They do not have enough farmers to provide enough food, despite the fact that there is a wealth of land, and much of that land too has been overworked because the Europeans did not believe in crop rotation. They did not believe in healthy farming techniques. They believed in, get me as much tobacco as you can. And again, you see that with the Germans. And then lastly, exporting the wealth outward and not focusing on developing internal industry, because that's what Europe wanted to do, has left Africa barren of the ability to do so. The Congo is owned by warlords who fight to gain all of the natural resources of the Congo to send back to America, to send back to Europe. And we're today a part of this because they, again, do not have the structures to do it themselves. Rather than give Africa their own factories, Europe simply took the resources, produced them in their own factories, and then sent them back. And so they don't have the structure to produce items despite having most of the natural resources. And so today, even as independent countries, they're reliant on Europe. Similarly, you see social Darwinism, the motive that they needed to go to Africa to spread their European culture because it was superior, really causing problems. The fact that they brought schools like, hooray, you guys can learn. We're bringing Western civilization, but only Western civilization. So these schools that Europeans brought and developed only taught European history, and they pushed the African histories to the side. So you see a cultural void there even today, where a lot of their old traditions are gone or are mixed up, and local languages as well. Many places in Africa you can go and they speak French or they speak English on top of their local dialects because Europeans forced it upon them. Even in South Africa, the Boers, they speak their own language that is a combination, and it's called Afrikaans, and it is made up of Dutch and African languages because the Europeans forced this upon them. In the political arena, moving through this, we see that the European want for land causes a lot of problems too, namely in ethnic groups. The Rwanda genocide and in Chad and Darfur, where different ethnic groups are now killing each other just because they are believed to be different. That stems from the fact that Europe cared more about giving themselves a lot of land rather than paying attention to what was already set up in Africa. Germany just wanted a bunch of land that was rich in natural resources. They didn't really care if you have two different warring ethnic groups that occupied that same territory. Britain didn't really care if the Boers had a poor relationship with their African neighbors, or if they had a racist relationship with it because the Boers were white. They just cared that they were going to get their diamonds and gold. And so they allowed these very racist structures to develop, or they allowed hate and tension between groups like the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda to come to dislike each other. And they actually encouraged that ethnic elitism, which creates a situation where when Europe leaves, you now have two groups that have to decide how they want to create their new country, but they also hate each other. It's not going to end well. It's just not. Like, it'd be like if I left a classroom and said, okay, students, do what you want, but I'm going to give this specific group all the power and they can do whatever they want. It's just not a structure for success. And then lastly, we also see the motives shaping the lasting impacts in Africa in religion. The fact that in the European society, women were subservient. Christianity taught that they were supposed to be the heads of the household. And so that is forced upon them to the point where now today, even in Africa, even though they're in control of their own territory, you still see the disparities where African women are now part of the household. African women cannot own property in some areas. They have different roles based off of the antiquated European one, because that was what was forced upon them by the Germans and the British and the French when they arrived, because that was their culture. That was seen as what was supposed to be the most effective. And so what you can see here is between all of these, the resistance, the impacts, the way that they shape the colonization of Africa, it's all driven by Europe first, whether it's the European economy to make more money, the European way of life, you have to speak French, you have to believe in Christianity, or just the European desire for land. You live where we tell you to, not where it would work best because we want to seem powerful. All of this creates an environment in Africa that is wholly negative and wholly unpleasant, and one that they cannot deal with because of the technological inequality. And that will become a recurring problem later on. And so if we were to characterize African imperialism as we are coming to a close on this session, it would be overwhelmingly negative. There is a wealth of clear evidence to suggest that European involvement was for the worse. And so that kind of sums up this week. And that'll wrap up imperialism in Africa as well. So next week, interesting, this shouldn't be here. Next week, we're going to be dealing with imperialism outside of Africa. So you guys will be watching a documentary on British India, and then we'll do a reading on the Ottoman Empire, on the Muslim world, and kind of revisiting that and seeing what they've been doing and what happens to them while Europe has been busy fighting and has now decided to start imperialism. And then we'll have a normal review on Friday. No one emailed me any questions, so there's none for me to answer today. As was not the case last week, but will be later. I will post this review online, and then you guys can go and watch it on YouTube, as well as any previous reviews in case you forgot something. So that's all I've got. Thanks for listening to the end if you chose to, and please stay healthy.